Hey, and welcome back to the Game Engine series. Today we will take our two third-party libraries, GLFW and GLAD, and turn them into actual static libraries using a software called Premake. We are going to start with a little intro on why we are using static libraries and not dynamic libraries, and then I will talk a bit about Premake itself, but only really short, and then we will get to creating those two static libraries and link them into our engine project. So let's talk a bit about libraries and why we need them. And actually, we wouldn't need them. We could just leave it like it is now. We copy the source files of GLFW and GLAD into our engine project and be done with it. That's fine, and the license also gives us permission to do that. But it's annoying because we have all these files we don't actually want. And the only thing we really need are the header files because they contain the declarations of the functions, the API, so to speak, and that's all we need to know, how the functions are called and how the signature is. And to enable us to do that, we will turn GLFW and GLAD into actual static libraries. So why are we using static libraries and not dynamic libraries? Well, generally speaking, a static library is easier to handle than a dynamic library, because the library is created by the build process and then it's linked into the executable file that we are building from our engine code. So in the end, we only have one file that we have to deploy if we would release the engine. If you are using a dynamic library, you have a DLL file, which you have to drag around. And you also have to export and import the functions from the DLL file, and that can be a bit annoying, at least in my experience. Static libraries usually are faster when loading than dynamic libraries because it's one executable file. Remember, you don't have to load stuff from a DLL file. Problem, or well, like disadvantages from static libraries are that they are usually the files become a bit larger because it's one huge blob in this file. And if we want to update the static library, or if GLFW, for example, brings out a new version, we have to recompile the library and link it again into the executable file of our engine. And that's basically all I want to say about libraries in C++. If you have further questions, you can put that in the comments, and I can make, for example, a dedicated video about that. But now I'm going to put myself into the bottom right corner, and we will start downloading Premake and make these static libraries. So we are searching for GitHub and Premake. First hit, usually Premake core. We go on releases and tags, choose the latest release, scroll down and download the download for Windows. Then you are going to extract that. And that's it already for the download for Premake. And if you open the extracted folder, we only need the Premake 5.exe. So I'm going to copy that into the engine's project folder. Under vendor, I'm going to make a new directory called Premake and just paste it here. And so that we don't forget it, we are also going to get the license file for Premake. Just going to go back to the starting file of the project. There is a license file here. Going to copy that text and just make a new text file here. Call that license.txt. Paste, save, and done. So let's talk about what Premake actually is, because I was a bit unclear earlier. Premake does not build these static libraries. Premake is a tool to create build configurations for different tool chains or IDEs like Visual Studio or Xcode or Make. If you recall the last episodes, you will remember that we had to make some changes to the Visual Studio project file, for example, adding like include directories. And that's exactly what Premake does. You create Lua files, they have to be written in the Lua language. And in these files, you define the project settings for the different projects. So we will have a project for GLFW, for GLAD, and for the engine. And then we have another Premake Lua file for the Visual Studio solution. And this way we can persist the project properties within these Lua files. And that makes it a lot easier to handle for us. And the amazing thing here is that we create these Lua files once, and then we have all the project properties stored within these files. They are visible at a glance. and we don't have to search through these complex and really cluttered Visual Studio property dialogues to find a certain setting. But before we start, we have to prepare the project directory structure a bit. So we are going to go into the root file of the engine project, and we are going to create a directory called dependencies. And we are going to copy everything from the vendor folder into the dependencies folder. And the reason for that is what I said earlier. If we would publish the engine, we will not have the dependency directory. We will only have the vendor directory with the header files, and that's why we will remove all the source folders from the third-party directories on the vendor. So for GLAD, remove the source folder. For GLFW, remove the source folder as well, because we will not need them. We will only need the header files, and they are in include and then the name of the third-party library again. That's for GLFW, and for GLAD, it's the same. So I would say we start with the Lua file for the Visual Studio solution. We are going to navigate into the root directory of our Lucy engine project, and we are going to create a file called premake5.lua. These files have to be called premake5.lua because Premake is searching for them, and then it creates the Visual Studio project based on the contents of that Lua file. So I prepared these files already to have like a template for that, because it would take too long to look up all the keywords we need. But if you want to have a reference, you just search for Premake, and it gives you their website. You can go and get started, and on the top right there is a search box, and you can just search for any keyword like project, and then it shows you like what it is, what it does, and also like an example how you use it. So I'm just going to open that file, the template I have on my off screen here. And then we will start implementing the Lua file for the solution. So we are going to refresh in Visual Studio. There's the Lua file, and we're just going to start. So the first thing we want to say is how the workspace is called. That's pretty much the name of the solution. Workspace is equal to like a Visual Studio solution. We call it Lucy Engine YouTube. Now everything belonging to that workspace has to be indented, because you can define several projects in one file, and everything that belongs to one project or to one workspace has to be indented. The next keyword is location. That's where the project or the solution lives. That's just the directory where the premake5.lua file is. Architecture is x86_64. And then we have the start project, and that will be Lucy Engine. Now we are defining the available configurations. That will be debug and release. For that we make a list. You make that like the name of the list and then curly brackets. And then you just say debug and release. The next is like flags you can give that a solution has, and we only want one, and that is called, I'm going to copy that, multiprocessor compile. And now we are defining an output directory. That's for the sub-projects we are going to define. I'm going to copy that as well, because it's a lot of dots and percentage signs. That's how the directory is called. Like a value of build config, that would be debug. And then you have the architecture, that's x86. So the directory looks something like this, debug, and then x86_64. That would be how the directory will be called and created. And now we are just going to include files that do not yet exist, but we are still going to define them here. That will be vendor, GLAD. Those are just the directories where those Premake5.lua files will reside. So under vendor and GLAD, there will be one. Under vendor and GLFW, there will be one. And under Lucy, there will be one. So I'm just going to copy that 3 times. This must not be indented. And the second one is GLFW, and the third one is just called Lucy. And that's it already for the Lua file for our Visual Studio solution. So let's do a quick recap here. We're defining a solution, Lucy Engine YouTube. Location is just where the Premake 5 file resides in our root directory of our project or of our solution. Architecture is 8664. The start project will be Lucy engine. Then we have two configurations, one flag we are giving the solution, and that's the output here where we will store the binary files that are created on building the project. And those are the three directories where Premake will search for like another Premake 5 file to then include that and create the subprojects for GLAD, GLFW, and Lucy. So the next one will be for GLAD. So we are going to navigate into vendor, GLAD, and the same thing, make a Premake 5.lua file. Then we're going back into Visual Studio, refresh, open that here. And I'm going to open the template I have for that as well. It's going to, there it is. And it's the same thing again. I'm just going to copy the first part of it. Now it's not workspace, it's a project. It will be called GLAD. It's a static library. Language is C. Architecture is the same, x86-64. Location for the project, for the Visual Studio project files will be where the Premake file lives. So in the GLAD, like vendor GLAD root directory. And now there are a couple of different statements in comparison to the solution file. I'm just going to copy them again. Makes it a lot faster than typing that. I'm just going to explain. So we have a target dir. That is where we are going to store the binary files that are created. And then we have an object dir. That's where the intermediate files from the build process will be stored. And the debug dir for the debugger will be the root directory for that project. So the next thing is include dirs. That's not a list with one entry, and that's just include. And we are always talking about relative paths here, so keep in mind that we are currently in the directory vendor GLAD, so every directory that we are like referencing from here is like a relative path. The next is which source files we are providing for the project, and that's just source. No, it's not. Now we have to go outside of this directory and navigate to the dependency directory. So we are going one directory back and another one. Now we are in the root directory. Let's check that. We are in vendor GLAD. We are going back once, twice. And then we are here. So now it's dependencies, GLAD, and then source. And then there is just one file, and that will be gl.c. So now we are going to set a couple of filters. I'm just going to copy them. These are just like settings for the different configurations and for the different operating systems. We are only using Windows, so we only have one filter. We're going to use the C++ dialect C++20 version is the latest, and static runtime is on. And for the debug configuration, we will have the runtime debug and symbols are on. And for release, we have release, symbols are on too, and it's fully optimized. And that's basically already it. So I'm just going to save that. So let's continue with GLFW. We are going to go into vendor and GLFW, create the Premake file, refresh in Visual Studio. And I'm going to open the template I have for that. I'm going to copy the beginning again. Where is it? And just paste that. So the project is called GLFW. It's a static library. It's really the same than for GLAD. The only difference is now that we are not defining global files to use for building the project, but they are in a filter for Windows, because we would actually need different files for Windows and, for example, Linux. But since we're only building for Windows now, that's fine. We are using all the files here. At a later point, I will probably like weed them out and get rid of the stuff we don't need. But for now, we are using all the files that GLFW is providing. I'm going to copy that path again here. going to paste that over here, and let's check that. So we are going back one directory, we're going back two directories, and then in dependencies and GLFW and source. So we're going to change that to GLFW, and we can actually also use the project.name variable here and also change that for GLAD. That makes it a bit more dynamic when copying this stuff. We are defining two compiler directives for GLFW under Windows 32 and no warnings for like unsafe code. We talked about it in the GLFW and Window episode. And yeah, that's actually it for GLFW already. And that only leaves the Lua file for our own code. So we are going into the Lucy Engine Solution root folder, go into Lucy and create a Premake file here as well. Refresh in Visual Studio, open it, and I'm going to open my template too. So that's a bit more complex now, that file. I'm going to copy the beginning again. We are calling that project Lucy Engine. It's a console app in C++. We have target, object, and debug there, and that's the same then for GLFW and GLAD. The include DS are now source. That's our own source, and then vendor GLAD include. Let's check if that path works. So we're going back once, then we go into vendor GLAD include and GLFW include. So that's fine. Now I'm going to copy the files list for the files that we are using to build the project. So we are going back, we are in the Lucy directory again, we're going back once, and we are including every header and C++ file. We need that to have the main.cpp file available. For now, that will change in the future, but for now we need that. And we are including also everything that lives under source, and the double asterisk here means that Premake is going to do a recursive directory traversal until the bottom and will include every file that's either a .h, .hpp, .cpp, or .inl for inline files. Now we need to specify which libraries the Lucy Engine project will link to, and that will be GLAD and GLFW. That is all done by Premake. We don't have to include any files here. We just have to call the right names, and that's GLFW and GLAD, so that's fine. And now we have some filters again. We are going to have filters for configuration debug. We are defining LU debug for Lucy debug and Lucy profiling. And if we are building for release, we will put release on 1 and debug and profiling on 0, and symbols will be on 2. And that's it for the Lucy Engine solution file already. So now that we created the 4 Premake files, the only thing left to do is to create the Visual Studio solution file by using Premake. We are going to make a copy of our project directory just to be safe. And then we are going to do a shift right click here and open the PowerShell window. If you added Premake to your environment paths, you can just call it with Premake 5, but I have to navigate there. So I'm going to do vendor, Premake, and then Premake 5 exe. And the only parameter this call gets is the toolchain or like IDE. So we say VS for Visual Studio in 2022 and submit that. And there's an error, of course. Attempt to call a nil value star. Okay, that's in the solution Premake file, and let's open that in Notepad++. There it's called star project. It needs to be start project. Okay. Now we go back, put that in front again, and just do it again, and that should work now. And that looks awesome. It created a file. So now I'm going to close that, and I'm going to close Visual Studio as well. And now we open it again with the new solution file, and that should give us our new project with 2 static libraries, GLFW and GLAD. Let's see if that actually worked. That looks fine. We have all the files of Lucy in our Lucy Engine project. We have the main file here. We see all the Premake files, so they are still there as well. And GLFW, those are libraries. We should see that somewhere here. That's a static library configuration. The same for GLAD, static library, and Lucy Engine should be a console app, or like an application. And we can see that our Lucy Engine project doesn't have any files of GLAD and GLFW anymore. It's only the files that we wrote ourselves. And we see all the files that GLFW and GLAD bring themselves. They are all there. So there's only one thing to do. Build a solution. That looks good for now. And if we start this now, we should see our red triangle. There we go. And that concludes the episode. I'm going to put myself into camera full screen mode again. You can see that Premake is an awesome piece of software. It's really annoying to manage these Visual Studio projects on your own, especially if you have several of them like we have now. Every third-party library we will add to our engine, we will make a new Premake file and create another static library if needed. Some libraries are like header only as well, where you don't even have source files. And yeah, that concludes the episode. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, then please subscribe and push the like button. And I'd say see you next time. Bye bye.